Have you ever read those verses at the beginning of Genesis chapter 6 about the sons of God marrying the daughters of men and wondered what's going on there? Who exactly are these sons of God? Who are the daughters of men? And was it a good thing that they got married? Let's take a look. All right, so let's get right into it. So Genesis 6, which begins like this. Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. Okay, so one of the reasons these verses have been challenging to understand is because, at least at first glance, they seem to come out of nowhere. I mean, we've just finished a 10-part genealogy in Genesis 5, and then all of a sudden we read about sons of God, a phrase that has not occurred anywhere in the narrative so far. And the obvious question is, who are these sons of God? Are these angels, like some people say? Or other supernatural beings who married humans and had children with them? Or are they human rulers or kings who are here acquiring some kind of a harem? Or is something else going on? Well, as always, the best way to find out is to actually look at the text in its immediate and wider context, which in this case would be the following verses in Genesis 6, as well as the previous texts in Genesis 1 to 5. So, if we look at the verses that immediately follow verses 1 and 2, we can basically divide them into two sections. First, we have verses 1 to 4, which talk about the marriages between the sons of God and the daughters of men, about God's reaction, and about the Nephilim, or mighty men that were on the earth in those days. And then we have verses 5 to 8, which talk about God being sorry for making man and saying that he would blot them out, and about Noah, who found favor in the Lord's eyes. Now, the interesting thing is that when you look closely at these two sections, you notice that they have a very similar setup. Both parts begin with a narrative section involving the terms man, sea, and great, followed by a divine speech, followed by another narrative section about important people. In the first section, it's the mighty men. In the second section, it's Noah. So we basically have a so-called parallel panel structure that looks something like this. Now, you may not realize it, but this setup is actually quite significant. And one reason is that it directly connects the marriages between the sons of God and the daughters of men with the wickedness of man. And that's important because, for one thing, it's a first indication how these marriages should be evaluated, but also it suggests that both the sons of God as well as the daughters of men are actually humans. Verse 5 doesn't say that God saw the wickedness of angels and man was great, but that he saw that the wickedness of man was great. In fact, if you look at both sections, you'll see that God only speaks about humans, never about angels or supernatural beings, which would be very strange if that was who the sons of God in this passage are. So they initiate the wickedness, but the consequences which God announces only apply to humans? That doesn't make sense. So that means both the immediate context as well as the structure of the passage strongly suggest that the sons of God are some kind of human beings. But the question is, can we be even more specific than that? And the answer is, we can. All we have to do is to look at the text directly before Genesis 6, in particular, chapters 4 and 5. Now, in both of these chapters, we have genealogies. And when you take a look at these, you'll notice that even though the expressions sons of God and daughters of men are not mentioned there, the terms sons and daughters do appear quite a number of times. So right before Genesis 6, sons and daughters are mentioned, and they're all clearly human. Well, you say, that may be so, but these are the sons of God. Doesn't that suggest that they are supernatural beings? And the answer is, not necessarily. Remember what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount? Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Or when Paul says in Romans 8 that all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. Or when God says in 1 Chronicles 28 that Solomon will be his son. So was Solomon a supernatural being? Of course not. Which means, according to the Bible, it is possible for human beings to be sons of God. Now the obvious question is, does that also apply to Genesis 6? Well, let's take a look at those two genealogies in chapters 4 and 5 again. So, as I've already explained in a previous video, these two genealogies present two lines. The first one, in chapter 4, which follows right after the fall, is the line of those who rebel against God and celebrate sin like Cain and Lamech. But the second one, in chapter 5, is the line of those who are faithful to God, who walk with him like Enoch, and who long for comfort and relief from the curse of sin, like the other Lamech, who's the father of Noah. Now, the interesting thing about these two genealogies is how they start. Notice that the first genealogy in Genesis 4 starts with man. Genesis 4:1 says, "Now the man had relations with his wife Eve," and so forth. But now look at the genealogy in chapter 5. Who does it begin with? It begins not with man, but with God. So what does that suggest? It suggests that those in the second genealogy, those in the line of Seth and the line of the faithful, are here presented as sons of God. So when you actually look at the text in context, it's pretty clear that Genesis 6 is not talking about some strange marriages between humans and supernatural beings, or about some rulers acquiring their harem, but simply about human beings from the line of Seth marrying people from the line of Cain. Now, we've already noted that the connection between verses 1 and 2 and verse 5 suggests that these marriages are problematic. But there's actually another indicator that shows how these marriages are to be evaluated, and that is the language that's used in verse 2. Notice that it says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and the actual Hebrew word here is tov, which means good. So they saw that the daughters of men were good, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. Now here's the question. What does this combination see plus good plus take remind us of? Well, there's only one previous place where this exact combination occurs, and that's in Genesis 3, where the woman sees that the tree was good for food and takes from its fruit. So when the author uses the exact same combination of terms in Genesis 6, it's clear that he views these actions by the sons of God as problematic, because they're basically doing the same thing Eve did. Instead of trusting God, they're taking something they shouldn't. And the reason they shouldn't becomes clear in the following verses. Because through the blending of the two lines, evil becomes so rampant on earth that in the end, only 8 people remain that are faithful to God. It's a sad story, and yet there's hope. Because one of that line, one son of God remains faithful. He listens to God and does what he tells him to do, which is to make a way of escape from the coming judgment. And so Noah becomes this savior figure who brings those who belong to him safely through the waters of the flood. And by doing so, he points forward to the divine Savior, the Son of God, who did not join forces with evil, but was faithful, even to the point of death, so that everyone who belongs to him can be saved and have everlasting life. So here's the question. Do we belong to him? Are we part of his family? Have we accepted him as our personal Savior? And are we willing to follow him so that he can lead us to safety? If you haven't made that decision yet, I want to encourage you to make it today. Trust me, it's the best decision you could ever make.